FM News Talk 97.1.
On-demand audio.
Some words of wisdom coming out of the mouth of Mitch McConnell there. We don't always expect that, so that's a bright spot on this Monday morning. How about that? I was glad to see that today. Thank you, Mitch. Thanks for pointing that out. More to talk about on that, although the Brexit vote has kind of overshadowed the House Democrats who held their sit-in the other day. What a joke that was. They didn't get as much mileage out of that over the weekend as they had hoped because these crazy Brits voted for their sovereignty. What were they thinking? I don't get it. Glad you're back with us here on the Marc Cox Show. Lots to come this hour. We're going to talk more about the Trump campaign and some of the supporters of the Missouri governor's race, which is heating up. There's some new polls out in that. Coming up in our next hour, the gun concealed carry bill, Senate Bill 656. Looks like the governor is going to veto that. It's going to be some fallout. It's going to have to go to a veto override maybe in September. We're going to talk to one of the senators who was first involved in that bill coming forward. And Josh Hawley is going to join us. Of course, running for Attorney General in Missouri. He has argued many cases before the Supreme Court. Thought he would be able to give us some good insight into not only the two decisions last week, but then obviously the one on abortion today that has come out. And we're going to get to that here in just a couple of minutes. Right now, I want to get back to today's Supreme Court ruling released this morning. They had two major rulings today, but the one that has caught our attention the most is obviously the Texas abortion law that's been thrown out. And Justice Kennedy has been the one who has switched sides again. So this would have been a 5-4 vote, even with Justice Scalia, it looks like. William Watkins joining us now from the Independent Institute. Thank you, sir. How are you?
Mark, I'm doing well. Thank you.
Give people your background a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure. I'm a research fellow at the Independent Institute. I've also been a practicing lawyer, both as a prosecutor and defense attorney, and I've written several books now on constitutional theory and Supreme Court's exegesis on our Constitution.
So the bottom line on this ruling today by the Supreme Court, does this mean that states can't do anything to regulate the doctors who are performing abortions in these clinics?
It means clearly that states have no ground to determine what they can and can't do. This is a confusing opinion. It retracts precedent from the Casey decision that Kennedy was a part of as well. And it really leaves no one with any idea what regulations a state would be allowed to apply to an abortion clinic.
Yeah, I not being a legal analyst, I looked at it as fairly confusing. Maybe it's because I'm on the pro-life side of this that I don't really understand why these regulations were so onerous. Can you maybe if I could understand why they think these were so restrictive? What I failed to grasp is what the law said is that these doctors had to have the clinics had to operate as ambulatory surgical centers, and the doctors had to be connected to local hospitals.
No, that's absolutely right. There were two provisions there. The state of Texas argued that both provisions were for the health of the patient involved there. The doctor had to be able to admit to a local hospital if something went awry, as well as for safety and health reasons. Clinics would be held to the same standards as outpatient surgical centers. The Supreme Court, however, going to Casey, said that these provisions placed an undue burden on a woman's ability to have an abortion. It further cited statistics, cherry-picked from the doctors in this case that these regulations would reduce the number of abortions in the state of Texas. And, of course, we know if anything even has the potential to do that, the court is going to look long and hard to try to strike it.
Sure. Yeah, it makes you wonder, in hindsight, if the decision to shut down some of the clinics was intentional so that the argument could be used that it limited women's access to abortion. Because the simple answer to me, if I'm running a business and regulations change, you try to adapt to those regulations. Is it that difficult? Maybe I need to have a doctor call into the show. Is it that difficult to be registered with a local hospital or be set up to provide ambulatory services in an abortion clinic?
No, it's not, because that's a fairly low standard to require that you have the same equipment, you have the same level of safety as an outpatient surgical center known as ambulatory surgical centers. We would hope that most doctors do have admitting privileges at local hospitals before they perform procedures. No, this is not a high bar whatsoever, but the Supreme Court has set the bar even higher by using this undue burden test and then essentially getting rid of the rational basis component of the Casey test, where the state regulation or law only had to have a rational basis to be connected with some legitimate state interest. Mere rationality. Court says now it has to be higher than mere rationality. Well, how high? It doesn't say. It doesn't tell us.
Well, I mean, depending on your position on Roe versus Wade, and I think everyone knows what mine is, it strikes me that they're doing somersaults here with the law to try to stay as far away from Roe as possible, right? For protecting Roe.
No, they're going to protect Roe at all costs, and even in this case shouldn't have gone forward because precisely the same claim had been made by these parties and upheld by the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, and they chose not to petition at the time the Supreme Court for review. In the law, we call that decision res judicata. The issue has already been decided. It's over. You cannot litigate it again. There has to be finality. Well, the court does all sorts of gymnastics to get around that so it can hear this case. There was no reason this case should be in front of them. It had already been decided, and there was no appeal. It was res judicata.
Wow. In analyzing this, can you look at a way that the state statute could be rewritten to achieve a similar goal but still exist?
You know, it would be very difficult because, as Justice Thomas said in his dissent, at this point, when the court chooses certain special rights and makes all these special exceptions in order to deliver a desired result, you really have no guidance. And frankly, for this, what the court calls the fundamental right of abortion, doesn't matter what tier of scrutiny it uses, whether they could call it rational basis, they could call it intermediate scrutiny, or they could call it strict scrutiny. If there is any way they can find that this is going to slow down the abortion mills, they're going to strike it. That's what the balance of power is on the court, and it's nothing but a political, policy-driven machine right now.
Yeah, boy, that's truer words have never been spoken. We're talking to attorney William Watkins, who is a research fellow for the Independent Institute, looking at this decision handed down by the United States Supreme Court today. If I could take you backwards a couple of days, there was a lot made of the decision last week that ended in a 4-4 tie that threw the decision back to a lower court. I've been making the argument to my audience that this election should hinge, your voting decision in this election should hinge on the Supreme Court, because there's nothing more important that we could decide in November than who appoints the next Supreme Court justice or justices.
There is without a doubt that if the Democrats were to take the White House, they will be able to establish a very liberal McGovernite majority on the court for many years to come. Certainly Justice Ginsburg, a reliable liberal vote, is up in years and has been ill. They will be able to replace her, likely. Of course, Scalia's open seat. Democrats don't miss with their Supreme Court appointments. Republicans often miss. They will be able to, set the stage for years to come. It is an important election in that regard. However, I would even go further and argue that the way the court has acted today, it's just making policy. Rather than simply electing the president, we ought to be electing Supreme Court justices insofar as the court is a policy-making branch now. It has completely disregarded any sort of blindness, judicial integrity. It's a policy-making branch. If it's going to make policy, the people, as the sovereigns of this country, ought to be able to vote on it.
Amen. We're talking to William Watkins, attorney and a research fellow for the Independent Institute, but I find it the perfect time to mention that you've got a new book out, Crossroads for Liberty.
Right, Crossroads for Liberty.
Yeah, and I think that is something that my listening audience would have a lot of interest in, because you're going back to the questions of what the founders actually intended for this country.
That's right. I start actually with the Articles of Confederation, and though historians and others claim that was just a failed system, it had to go, I take a harder look at it and conclude that, frankly, the Articles were truer to our founding principles and the Declaration of Independence, and could have been easily amended to keep a more federative system than what we have, and that the anti-federalists, in arguing against the Constitution, were right on almost all respects, rather than what we have today as the Supreme Court or other leaders abusing the Constitution in unforeseen ways. They're doing exactly what the anti-federalists said the language would allow them to do, and I show that in Crossroads for Liberty. And arguing that if we're going to reform our government, we need to look back to our first Constitution, to those original objections of the anti-federalists, and from there, perhaps we can come up with some solutions.
Well, it sounds like a great book, and I would encourage people to look it up. Crossroads for Liberty. William J. Watkins, the author, and our guest this hour from the Independent Institute. Mr. Watkins, thank you for your important insight.
Great to be with you. Have a good one.
Thank you very much. That's good stuff. I'm going to have to get a hold of that book and read it, because so often people wonder, what was the intent and where did that thinking come from? And you heard him say that the anti-federalists were right on just about every count. And we're seeing that kind of play out now in so many ways. Let me get to a couple of phone calls here real quick. Ann, you're on the air. Thanks for calling.
Oh, thank you so much. I have been down at the abortion clinic, standing out there trying to talk those girls out of having abortions, because many of them are so young it's going to affect them permanently in a variety of ways. But the reason I called was there are mothers of girls that go in for those abortions that are thankful that particular abortion clinic is right across the street from a hospital.
That's the one in Granite City?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And that's the reason they chose that particular abortion clinic, because things do go wrong. And I have been there when the hearse has come in and picked up a young lady who lost the baby in an abortion, and they didn't even make it across the street to the hospital. But in most instances, they can, at least to prevent them from bleeding to death. And it's something that these mothers, if they knew, a lot of the times, they don't know. And the school is no longer obligated to tell a parent that their child is leaving at 10 o'clock in the morning to go to Granite City to have an abortion, which I think is hideous, but that's beside the point. But anyway, I would be very concerned. I think all mothers of teenage girls ought to write letters and try to, do something about this, because there needs to be a medical facility, a real medical facility, close to those abortion clinics, because we know that those doctors that work there are there because they really can't get a job anyplace else. Let's face it. And
thank you for that insight there. I appreciate it, and it does it does kind of warp the mind when you think about it. These clinics in Texas that are in question would rather shut down than hire doctors who are connected, have rights to go practice at the local medical centers. Who are they hiring? Who are these abortion doctors? It's disturbing. 314-969-9797. Sarah Huckabee is going to be in the studio with us coming up this hour. Stick around.